The night they brought a white animal control van to take my retired canine away, I offered them my job, my badge, and my future. Anything but Atlas. He stood beside my left leg with his gray muzzle lowered, calm as always, while the school counselor said he had lunged at a student. 2 officers waited near the van. My fiancé stood behind the woman accusing us, and for one terrifying second, I imagined Atlas looking back at me through a cage door, wondering why I had let strangers take him. Then the van door slid open behind him. Metal scraped against metal. Atlas heard it. His ears moved once, and that single movement almost broke me. Then he lifted his head, walked past the counselor, stopped in front of her handbag, and sat. Not barked, not growled, sat. The same way he used to sit in front of hidden electronics, remote triggers, and things that could kill people overseas. That was the first time Vivian Cole lost control of her face. And that was the moment I understood something everyone else had missed. She had planned for teachers, parents, students, cameras, rumors, lawyers, and panic. She had not planned for the one witness she could not charm. My name is Mara Vance. At 39, I thought I had already lived through the worst kind of silence. The kind after a blast, the kind after a radio stops answering, the kind inside a hospital room when a young soldier realizes his life will never return to what it was before. I spent 16 years in the Army as a military police canine handler. My partner was Atlas, a Belgian Malinois with one torn ear, one silver tooth, and eyes that made people confess things they had not admitted to themselves. Atlas had searched trucks, barracks, supply yards, abandoned buildings, and roadside debris. He had been trained to detect explosives, ammunition, hidden weapons, electronic devices, batteries, and certain chemical traces tied to remote triggers. He was not magic. He was something better than magic. He was consistent. By the time we retired, his muzzle had gone gray, and my sleep had become something I visited instead of something I lived in. Some mornings, Atlas needed a full minute before his back legs agreed with him. I pretended not to notice. He pretended not to know I was pretending. So when my fiancé, Ethan Price, suggested I take a job at Hawthorne Ridge Academy, I wanted to believe him. "It's perfect for you," he said one evening, while we ate takeout over our kitchen counter. Student safety coordinator, emergency planning, crisis protocols. You'd be helping kids before things go wrong. Ethan taught literature there. He was gentle with students, careful with parents, and easy for administrators to like, because he never made anything difficult. That should have warned me, but Ethan had not always been a man who chose comfort over truth. 3 weeks before I started at Hawthorne, I woke at 3:14 in the morning with my hand pressed against the wall beside our bed. Atlas was already at the bedroom door, lying sideways like a barricade between me and the hallway. I sat up, breathing too fast. Ethan did not touch me right away. He knew better. Instead, he went to the kitchen, brought back a glass of water, and placed it on the nightstand. "He keeps you here, doesn't he?" Ethan asked quietly. I looked at Atlas. His eyes were open, calm and steady in the dark. "He always has," I said. Ethan sat beside me, not too close. "Then he stays wherever we go." That was why what happened later hurt so much. Because Ethan had once understood. Hawthorne Ridge Academy looked like a school built for brochures. Red brick buildings, ivy-covered walls, white columns, and donor names carved into nearly every entrance. On my first morning, Atlas and I crossed the quad just before the first bell. He wore a simple Navy retired service harness, with his name stitched in white. No tactical gear, no intimidation, just Atlas. Older now, slower on cold mornings, but still carrying himself like every room deserved to be evaluated. A freshman stopped near the library steps. "Is that a police dog?" he asked. "Retired military," I said. "Does he bite?" "Only reputations." The boy blinked. Atlas yawned. The boy laughed and ran off. That was the last uncomplicated laugh I heard at Hawthorne Ridge for a long time. I met Vivian Cole 5 minutes later. She stepped out of the administration building, with soft brown curls, a cream cardigan, a gold necklace, and a clipboard held to her chest like it contained the names of children she personally intended to save. "Mara Vance," she said warmly. Finally, her voice had the kind of softness people trust before they understand why. I'm Vivian, school counselor. I've heard so much about you. That makes one of us. She laughed gently, as if I had meant to be charming. Oh, I love dry humor. Ethan warned me you were direct. Ethan appeared behind her with 2 coffees. I said direct in a good way, he said quickly. Vivian turned and touched his sleeve. Just once. Just lightly. Not enough to accuse. Enough to notice. Atlas noticed too. His ears shifted forward. Vivian looked down at him and smiled. And this must be Atlas. Don't reach over his head, I said. Her hand paused in midair. Oh, of course. Sorry. Her eyes softened. I'm used to therapy dogs. He's friendly, I said. He just prefers honesty. Vivian's smile stayed in place. Her eyes changed. That was the first warning, and I ignored it because I wanted the job to work. My first assignment sounded boring, which usually meant it mattered. Headmaster Malcolm Reed gave it to me during orientation in his office, with Ethan leaning by the window and Vivian seated beside the bookshelf. We'd like you to review emergency access protocols, Reed said. After-hours records room permissions, student safety files, and any emergency support requests connected to counseling or crisis response. Vivian smiled when he said it. Not nervously, not openly, just a little too quickly. That includes financial support requests? I asked. Reed adjusted his glasses. Only where student safety is involved. Transportation, temporary housing, counseling referrals, scholarship emergencies. Nothing controversial. People say, nothing controversial, when they are hoping paperwork will stay asleep. Vivian folded her hands over her clipboard. I'm sure Mara will find our systems very compassionate. Compassionate. That was the first word she used as a shield. 3 days later, I opened the door that made me her enemy. It was a rainy Thursday evening. I was doing a routine walkthrough of Alder Hall after study period. Atlas padded beside me, quiet and focused. The building was supposed to be empty except for dorm staff, but I saw light under the records room door. I knocked twice. Campus safety, I called. Who's in there? The whispering inside stopped. The door opened a few inches. Riley Chen stood in the gap, pale and trembling. I recognized her from a scholarship orientation file. Sophomore. Quiet. Excellent grades. Mother worked night shifts at a hospital. Accommodation paperwork in process. Behind Riley stood Vivian, one hand on Riley's shoulder, the other holding a manila folder. Oh, Vivian said. Mara, you startled us. Records room is restricted after hours. Vivian gave me a patient smile. Riley needed accommodation paperwork. She's been under a lot of stress. Riley stared at the floor. You okay? I asked her. Her lips parted, but Vivian's fingers tightened slightly on her shoulder. She's overwhelmed, Vivian said. A uniformed authority figure in a hallway probably isn't helping. I'm not in uniform. Vivian blinked. For half a second, the mask slipped. Then she smiled again. You know what I mean. I looked at the folder. Do you have written authorization to remove records? Vivian laughed softly. I'm her counselor. That's not what I asked. The hallway turned cold. Ethan appeared at the far end with a stack of essays under one arm. Everything okay? He asked. Vivian lowered her voice just enough for him to lean in. I didn't realize helping a student in crisis would be treated like misconduct. Riley flinched. Ethan moved closer. Mara, maybe this can wait. It can't. Vivian looked at Riley, not at me. Riley already feels unsafe around people who interrogate her. I looked at Riley. She whispered, please. I thought she meant please stop. Later, I wondered if she meant please don't leave me alone with her. I stepped back. Bring the folder to administration in the morning. I'll log the access. Vivian nodded. Of course. As she passed me, she said quietly, you didn't have to corner her by the blue cabinets. I turned. The cabinets in that room were gray, and from the doorway, Vivian could not have seen where I had been standing before she opened it. It was a tiny mistake. Tiny mistakes matter. I wrote it down that night, in a notebook I had bought from the campus store. Date, time, location, exact words, witnesses, evidence, missing evidence, pattern. The army taught me something simple. When emotions flood a room, facts need somewhere dry to stand. The next morning, Sloane Pike posted the video. I did not know Sloane yet, not really. I knew her as the junior, with perfect hair, a ring light in her dorm room, and a follower count that made some teachers nervous. Sloane was not evil. She was hungry. Vivian understood the difference. The clip showed Vivian standing protectively beside Riley, while I stood stiffly in the hallway with Atlas at my side. Caption: New safety director interrogates panic attack student after hours. Hawthorne is not a war zone. By lunch, 3 parent group chats had it. By dinner, someone had printed the phrase, "not a war zone," and taped it to my office door. Vivian did not need to tell Sloane what to post. She only needed to say, "I hope no one twists what happened tonight," in front of a girl who measured truth by engagement. By the next morning, Headmaster Reed called me in. Vivian sat beside his desk with a tissue folded in both hands, but she was not crying. That was worse. Silence made the room fill in the accusation for her. Ethan stood by the window. Reed looked tired before the conversation even started. "Mara, we have a situation." I followed access protocol. Vivian looked down. "This isn't about protocol. It's about how Riley felt. Student files are private for a reason, and trauma requires flexibility," Vivian said. There it was again. Trauma, wrapped in velvet and sharpened underneath. Reed shifted in his chair. "We'd like you to apologize to Riley." "For what?" "For making her feel unsafe. I'll apologize if Riley tells me that directly." Vivian said nothing. She did not have to. Reed looked at her, then at Ethan, then back at me. Ethan said, "Mara, it's one apology." I looked at him. "Is it?" He looked away. That was when I realized Ethan did not want truth. He wanted calm. Those are not the same thing. I left with a written warning. Atlas was the only one who walked out beside me without hesitation. For the next week, I learned how fast a reputation can be rebuilt by strangers and destroyed by a 30-second clip. Students stopped petting Atlas. Teachers lowered their voices when I entered the faculty lounge. Parents stared at me during drop-off like they had accidentally hired a security threat. Ethan told me to let it pass. "Teenagers move on," he said. "Adults don't." He rubbed his forehead. "Vivian is protective, maybe too protective. But she cares. She was in a restricted room with a student file. She was helping Riley. Were you there?" "No, but you believe her." His face tightened. "I believe there was a misunderstanding." When people say misunderstanding, they usually mean the person who stayed calm must apologize to the person who cried. That night, I wrote another line at the bottom of my timeline. I thought Vivian wanted me embarrassed. I was wrong. She wanted me isolated. 3 days later, Theo Alvarez walked into my office without knocking. Theo was the tech kid. Every school has one. The student adults called difficult, right before asking him to fix the projector. He had chipped black nail polish, a cracked phone screen, and eyes that made grown people feel like poorly secured passwords. "You know the video was edited, right?" he said. I looked up. "Close the door." He did. "How do you know?" "Sloane exports everything through the media lab because her laptop overheats. The posted file is shorter than the export." "Do you have the original?" "No." "Can you get it without breaking laws or school policy?" Theo looked offended. "That removes most of my charm." "Theo, I can ask the Media Lab supervisor to confirm the export log." "Do that." He hesitated at the door. "Riley looked scared before you knocked," he said. "Not after." "Why tell me?" Theo looked through the narrow glass panel in my office door. "Because Ms. Cole knows where cameras stop." Then he left. A student had noticed the battlefield before most adults admitted there was one. The second incident came through the Senior Service Trip Fund. $4,600 disappeared from a locked drawer in the Student Activities office. At 2:30 that afternoon, Dean Burke found the money in my bottom desk drawer. I met Dean Burke properly that day. Athletic director, loud voice, red face. The kind of man who believed confidence could substitute for accuracy if delivered with enough volume. He was not Vivian's partner. He was something more useful to her, a man who disliked being corrected and loved moving fast when angry. He stood in my doorway holding 2 envelopes of cash. "Oh, you have got to be kidding me," he said. "Reed needs to see this." I stared at the envelopes. Atlas lifted his head from the rug. "Don't touch anything else," I said. Dean Burke smirked. "That sounds like something guilty people say." "No, it sounds like something trained people say." In Reed's office, Vivian was already there. That bothered me. Riley was not. That bothered me more. Reed looked sick. "Mara, do you have an explanation?" "Yes. Someone planted it." Dean Burke laughed once. "Of course. I don't handle student money." Vivian did not defend herself. She did not accuse me directly. She only looked at Reed, then at the door, as if she had already decided who would be blamed next. I said, "Check the hallway camera outside my office." Dean Burke cleared his throat. "It was down last night. Caleb Ortiz had been called because he managed building access and security systems. Caleb was the maintenance marine, quiet, practical, and allergic to drama. He had served before Hawthorne hired him, and you could see it in how he watched doors instead of faces." He frowned. "No, it wasn't." Everyone turned toward him. Reed said, "Caleb, that camera went offline for 6 minutes at 9:14 p.m. because someone unplugged it. The system logged an interruption, not a failure." Vivian touched her necklace. "Could a student have done that?" Caleb shook his head. "Admin wing locks after 9. Keycard only. Pull the keycard logs," I said. Reed refused. "No," he said, too quickly. "We are not turning this office into a criminal investigation because every uncomfortable question becomes a conspiracy." The room went still. For the first time, Reed was not passive. He made a decision. It was the wrong one. I said, "You hired me to review access protocols." "I hired you to keep students safe," Reed snapped. "Not to accuse half my staff because you dislike being questioned." Vivian lowered her eyes, but I saw her hand relax around the tissue. Before I could answer, Eleanor Whitby spoke from the corner of the office. She had been waiting for a donor meeting and had heard enough. Eleanor was the board power, the woman whose scholarship money had built half of Hawthorne's polished conscience. "Pull the logs, Malcolm," she said. Reed's jaw tightened. He pulled them. 4 cards had entered the admin wing between 9 o'clock and 9:30. Mine, Reed's, Burke's, Vivian's. Vivian spoke calmly this time. "I came back for my laptop. Ethan knew. I called him from the parking lot because I was uncomfortable after what happened last week." Ethan nodded slowly. "She did call me. My card had been used at 9:22, but I had been in my apartment with Atlas asleep across my feet. My card was in my jacket," I said. "In my office." Dean Burke leaned forward. "So someone stole your card, planted money, unplugged a camera, and returned it?" "Yes. That's a lot." "It is." At that moment, I assumed someone had physically taken my card. Later, the outside audit would show something more precise and more dangerous. A duplicate access fob had been created under my employee ID from an administrator-level terminal. My real card never had to leave my jacket. But that afternoon, we did not know that yet. Reed placed me on administrative restriction pending review. No patrols, no student contact, no access to files. Not fired, not cleared, just parked. Institutions love parking problems. That night, Ethan stood in our kitchen and said, "I defended you." "For what?" "For housing." Reed asked if campus housing should be suspended. I stared at him. "You think I stole that money?" I don't know what to think. The sentence landed harder than an accusation. Atlas stood and moved between us. Ethan looked down at him. "Even the dog doesn't like me now?" "The dog is reading the room." He pushed back from the counter. "I can't keep defending you if you keep treating everyone like an enemy." "I'm not treating everyone like an enemy." "No, just everyone who doesn't automatically agree with you." I did not answer, because a part of me wondered if he was right. That was Vivian's first real victory. Not the warning, not the money, but doubt. The next morning, an email went out from my school account to Riley Chen. Subject, "Stop lying." Body, "If you keep telling people I scared you, I'll make sure everyone knows what kind of girl you really are." It was crude. Too crude. That offended me almost as much as being framed. By lunch, the email had been forwarded through the parent circles. and Reed had another reason to keep me restricted. But the IT supervisor found what mattered. The message had not been sent from my laptop. It had been drafted from a terminal near the counselor suite, beside the same printer room where Atlas had paused earlier, using an admin override. "Can you prove who sat there?" I asked Theo when he brought me the first hint. Theo shook his head. "No, but the external audit can." "Then we wait." He stared at me. "You know who did it." Knowing and proving are cousins, not twins. I requested an outside digital audit in writing. Reed did not approve it, but he did not deny it either. Eleanor Whitby, the donor who could move board members with one email, asked to be copied on future safety-related evidence. Vivian noticed. For several days, she changed tactics. No tears, no public accusations, kindness. She sent me a message. "Mara, I know this is painful for you. I hope one day you can see that stepping back is not defeat. Sometimes it is healing." I printed it, dated it, and filed it. The binder was getting heavy. Heavy things are harder to dismiss. Vivian also started working on Atlas. Not openly. Vivian almost never did anything openly if a whisper could do it first. She asked Nurse Tessa to document any sign of aggression from him. She told Ethan that my attachment to Atlas might make objective reporting difficult. She mentioned to Reed that several younger students seemed visibly tense when Atlas crossed the quad, even though I had seen those same students sneaking him biscuits outside the dining hall. Tessa told me later, it felt strange. She wasn't asking whether he had done something. She was asking me to watch until he did. That was Vivian's gift. She did not need to invent a storm all at once. She only had to convince people to carry umbrellas indoors. At the same time, Atlas was getting older. Most people saw the harness, the alert ears, the old working discipline. They did not see what happened before sunrise, when I rubbed warmth into his back legs until he stopped pretending he did not need it. They did not see him pause at the bottom of stairs, calculating the climb like a mission. They did not see the way he still put himself between me and every closed door, even when standing up cost him. That was why Vivian's next move was not just cruel. It was personal. 2 days later, Riley disappeared. By noon, Riley's roommate said she had never returned after a counseling appointment. Vivian told Reed that Riley had been terrified of me and might have run because the school failed to protect her. For 1 hour, campus became chaos. Parents called, students cried. Sloan posted a black square. Ethan called me. "Mara, did Riley contact you?" "No." "Are you sure?" That was the end of us. Not officially, not with shouting, just there, in that question. "I'm hanging up," I said. "Mara, wait." "No." I found Caleb outside the maintenance shed. Caleb, the maintenance marine, did not waste time asking useless questions. "I need old campus maps," I said. He unlocked a metal cabinet and pulled out laminated maps from before the West Dorm renovation. "There's an old boathouse by the lower pond," he said. "Kids used to sneak there." "How do you know?" "I used to be one of the kids." Atlas picked up Riley's scent from a scarf Tessa found in the nurse's office. We moved through the lower trail, fast but quiet. He was not solving a mystery. He was doing what he had always been trained to do. Follow what was real, when people were busy arguing about what they felt. We found Riley at the boathouse, sitting on the floor with her knees pulled to her chest. She was alive, shaking, and holding a cheap prepaid phone. When she saw me, she burst into tears. "I didn't want to do it." I knelt at the doorway, not moving closer. "Do what?" She said if I didn't leave, my scholarship review would go badly. She said my mother would get the bill. "Who said that?" Riley looked past me like she expected the trees to answer. "Vivian." Theo had followed us at a distance. He pulled out his phone. I said, "No recording unless she consents." Riley laughed through tears. "She records everyone." Then she handed me the prepaid phone. On the screen were messages from an unsaved number. "Go to the boathouse. Do not answer anyone except me. If Mara finds you, act scared. Remember what happens if the board sees your disciplinary file." There was also a photo of Riley's confidential counseling notes. I felt something inside me go still. Anger can burn, but real rage freezes. "Riley," I said carefully, Do you consent to show this to your mother and an attorney? She nodded. Say it clearly. I consent. We did not take Riley to Reed first. We took her to Nurse Tessa. Tessa called Riley's mother. I called Nina Patel, a civil attorney I knew from a veterans legal clinic. Then we called Reed. Vivian arrived at the nurse's office 20 minutes later, breathless from walking too fast. She did not cry this time. She looked at Riley, then at Riley's mother, then at me, and I could almost see her choosing which face the room needed. Riley, Vivian said softly. Thank God. Riley stepped behind me. The room noticed. Vivian noticed the room noticing. Mara, Vivian said. What did you say to her? Riley's mother arrived in scrubs, still wearing her hospital badge. She read the messages. She looked at her daughter. Then she looked at Vivian. If you speak to my child again without my lawyer present, she said, you will regret it for the rest of your life. Vivian went still. Reed placed Vivian on temporary leave pending review. Because the phone was prepaid, because the number was not yet traced, and because Vivian claimed someone had stolen screenshots from her office and was framing her too, the school treated the situation like a legal hazard instead of a moral emergency. It sounded ridiculous. But ridiculous becomes complicated when institutions are terrified of lawsuits. Still, things changed. Students stopped whispering only about me. Now they whispered about her. That scared Vivian more than accusation. Riley was alive, but what she carried in her hand was worse than a missing person report. The next crack came from June Maddox. June was the student journalist who had already lost one article to Vivian's pressure. Sharp eyes, sharper questions, and the dangerous habit of reading footnotes adults hoped students would ignore. She found me outside the library with a laptop under one arm. I think the scholarship fund is weird, she said. I stopped walking. What scholarship fund? The Whitby Hope Fund. Emergency tuition assistance, counseling support, temporary housing, transportation, all the feel-good stuff donors love. Why are you looking at it? My Riley article got killed. By whom? Reed. He said it would re-traumatize her. That sounds like Vivian. June opened her laptop on a stone bench. I found 3 emergency grants last year that never reached the students listed. On paper, the money went to counseling support vendors. Which vendors? Bloom Path Wellness, Crescent Student Care, Hale Consulting. The names were gentle enough to be suspicious. June clicked another tab. All 3 used the same mailing address. I leaned closer. A lake house? Owned by Vivian's aunt. June kept scrolling. One student lost housing for a semester because the emergency fund had supposedly already been used. Another family took a private loan they never should have needed. That changed the air around us. Numbers were one thing. A student sleeping on a friend's floor because money had been rerouted through a fake counseling vendor was something else. The next day, June's draft article disappeared from the school server. No dramatic fake chat. No long manifesto. Just gone. The document history showed an administrative access event from the counselor suite. During the same hour Vivian was supposedly on temporary leave, but still had remote credentials that no one had bothered to disable. June stared at the screen and whispered, "She's not just hiding something." "No," I said. "She's testing what still works." Theo noticed the deletion trail, but Nina sent it to an independent digital consultant before we treated it as evidence. It was not proof of everything. It was another piece of the pattern. By then, Nina had begun helping me organize the evidence. She sat at my kitchen table one evening with my binder open, a yellow legal pad beside her, and Atlas snoring beneath her chair. Nina was small, blunt, and allergic to emotional nonsense. "This is not one problem," she said. "I know." "No. Listen, if we approach this as Mara versus Vivian, you lose. I didn't ask for a personal war. Doesn't matter. That's how she's framing it. Unstable veteran versus beloved counselor. I hated how accurate that was. So what do? We prove a system. Not feelings, not motives. System. She drew 3 circles on the pad. Files, money, narrative. Vivian controls confidential student files, Nina said. She uses them to create pressure. She helps direct emergency funds. Then she shapes the public story before anyone can check evidence. Hawthorne did not have one villain problem. It had a trust problem. Too many permissions, too few audits, and too many adults who confused discretion with goodness. Vivian was not everywhere. She did not need to be. The school gave her open doors, soft passwords, delayed reviews, and adults who wanted the easiest explanation. She only had to push each person in the direction they were already leaning. That was Vivian's machine, and machines can be dismantled one bolt at a time. The Founders Gala became the bolt that slipped. Every year, Hawthorne Ridge held a donor event in the old dining hall. Reed told me to attend because visibility mattered. By then, I understood visibility usually meant optics. Atlas came with me because I no longer trusted any room I entered without him. Inside the gala, Vivian wore pale blue and a forgiving smile. When she saw me, she leaned slightly closer and said, "You should have resigned while people still felt sorry for you." My phone was already recording. Not secretly. Nina had advised me to record my own interactions where legally allowed. I smiled. "Say that again." Vivian stepped back at once. "I don't know why you're attacking me." A donor turned to look. Ethan appeared beside her. "What happened?" I looked at him. "If you ask me whether I threatened her, I will walk out of this building, and you will never get another answer from me." He went silent. For once, he did not ask. 10 minutes later, Eleanor Whitby's donated bracelet vanished from the auction display table. Sloane Pike found it in Atlas's canvas supply bag beneath the coat table. I said, "No one touch the bag." Dean Burke started to object, but Eleanor stopped him. "She's right." Security called local police. The bracelet had no fingerprints from me. The bag zipper had fibers from Sloane's scarf. By midnight, Sloane admitted Vivian had told her the bracelet was a replica, and that moving it would teach Mara how it feels to make others unsafe. Vivian never texted instructions. She said it all in person, inside the counselor suite, with the door closed. When confronted, Vivian stayed calm. "I trusted Sloane," she said. "I tried to mentor her. I never imagined she would twist my words. Then she made one small mistake. I only told Sloane the auction table would be unattended after Eleanor's speech. No one had mentioned when the bracelet went missing. Eleanor heard it. Her face changed. For the first time, a powerful adult looked at Vivian with suspicion instead of sympathy. The board approved an outside review the next morning. Vivian knew the wall was closing, so she went after Atlas. It happened 3 days before the review meeting. I was walking Atlas past the chapel when Riley came out of counseling with Vivian. I stopped at a respectful distance. Atlas sat automatically. Riley looked at him and gave a small smile. Then Vivian stumbled backward and cried out. He lunged. No one moved. Vivian clutched her forearm. He lunged at Riley. I stepped in front of her. Riley went white. Vivian turned to her. Her voice dropped low, gentle, controlled. "It's okay, sweetheart. You don't have to protect anyone." Within 30 minutes, Reed called animal control. By the time I reached the administration building, 2 officers stood near a white van. Atlas stood beside me, calm but alert. I could feel his breathing through the leash. The van door slid open. Metal scraped against metal. Atlas's ears moved once. He remembered kennels. He remembered transport crates. He remembered waiting in places where handlers did not always come back for their dogs. Or maybe I was the one remembering. Either way, it nearly undid me. Reed looked miserable. "Mara, until this is investigated, Atlas has to leave campus." "No. Mara, no." The animal control officer was kind, which somehow made it worse. "Mara, if there's an active complaint involving a dog and a student..." "He didn't touch anyone." Vivian lifted her bandaged arm. "I wish that were true." Ethan stood behind her. Not beside me. Behind her. Something inside me cracked. I stepped forward. "Take my job." The room went quiet. Reed blinked. "What?" "Put me on leave. Fire me. Ban me from campus. I don't care." "But you are not putting my dog in a van because she needs another performance," Vivian whispered. "This is exactly the instability I'm talking about." My hand shook on the leash, not from fear of Vivian, but from the thought of Atlas looking back at me from inside that van, wondering why I had let strangers take him. I had sent him into danger before. I had trusted him in places where one wrong step could end both of us. But I had never abandoned him, and I would not let his final years become a punishment for staying loyal to me. My breath shortened. The room blurred at the edges. Vivian saw it. For half a second, she smiled. Atlas pressed his shoulder against my leg. That pressure brought me back. 4 counts in, 4 counts hold, 4 counts out. I lowered my voice. "You're right," I said. Vivian blinked. "I'm emotional because someone is threatening the only partner who never abandoned me. But emotion does not change evidence." The door opened. Nurse Tessa walked in fast, holding a medical form. Tessa looked frightened, but she looked more angry than frightened. "Stop this," she said. Vivian turned. Tessa's voice shook, but she did not stop. "I treated Vivian's arm. It is not a dog bite. It is a straight, superficial cut. No puncture pattern, no bruising, no saliva." She refused a swab. Vivian's face hardened. I was in shock. "You asked me whether a dog bite report required removal from campus before I even cleaned the wound," Tessa said. Reed looked at Vivian. Riley started sobbing. "She told me to say Atlas moved toward me. She said he would only be taken off campus. She said no one would hurt him." Vivian's mask slipped. For 1 second, there was no counselor, no soft voice, no wounded eyes, just rage. Then she lowered her chin and went quiet again, but no one stepped toward her. Animal control left without Atlas. Vivian was placed on administrative leave again. This time, she hired an attorney. The night before the board review, she sent a letter to every parent on the emergency contact list. It was not a live stream, not a public meltdown. Vivian was too controlled for that. It was worse. A polished, careful, devastating letter. She wrote that she had stayed silent to protect vulnerable students. She wrote that a former military officer had created an atmosphere of fear. She wrote that students were being pressured into statements. She wrote that a retired attack dog had been used to intimidate witnesses. She never said anything directly enough to be easily sued. She did not have to. By morning, parents were calling for answers. The board review moved to the library conference hall. Not an auditorium, not a public trial, just 12 adults around a long table, 3 student witnesses with parents, 2 attorneys, Headmaster Reed, Eleanor Whitby, Dean Burke, Vivian, and me. A retired judge named Helena Cross had been hired to conduct the review. She began by placing a written protocol in front of everyone. All evidence packets had been submitted in advance. No one would open or handle new devices without permission. Any physical item introduced during the meeting would be preserved for chain of custody. No interruptions, no direct address to student witnesses, no emotional speeches disguised as questions. I liked her immediately. Atlas lay beside my chair. Vivian arrived in white. Of course she did. Her attorney sat to her right. Ethan sat at the far end as a faculty witness. He looked like he had not slept. Helena Cross opened with a flat voice. "This is not a popularity contest. This is a fact review." Vivian's attorney spoke first. He presented me as rigid, traumatized, and increasingly fixated on Vivian. He said my military background made me interpret normal counseling discretion as suspicious. He said my dog's presence escalated fear among students. Vivian did not cry. That was smarter. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, but not weak. "I made mistakes," she said. "I cared too much. I blurred boundaries because students came to me when no one else listened." A few board members softened. She continued, "Mara sees patterns because her training taught her to look for threats. But children are not threats. Counselors are not enemies. Schools are not battlefields. Battlefields. Not war zones. Same family of language." She knew exactly what she was doing. Then Nina stood. "We agree schools are not battlefields," she said. "That is why evidence matters before someone is publicly labeled dangerous." She placed 3 binders on the table. 3 issues, Nina said. Files, money, narrative. She opened the first binder. Files. Vivian Cole had access to confidential student records. Riley Chen's counseling notes appeared on a prepaid phone used to pressure her into leaving campus. Marcus Bell's file was referenced when he was pressured to support Vivian's version of events. Private details about Mara and Atlas, shared by Ethan under the pretense of concern, later appeared in Vivian's complaint. She opened the second binder. Money, emergency support funds tied to counseling referrals, were routed through vendors with compassionate names and one shared address, a lake house owned by Vivian Cole's aunt. One student lost housing for a semester because the emergency fund had supposedly already been used. Another family took a private loan while donor funds sat on paper under a fake vendor. Then she opened the third narrative. The edited video, the planted money, the fake email, the deleted article, the bracelet incident, the parent letter, and the false dog complaint all served the same purpose: to make Mara Vance look unstable before anyone reviewed the underlying evidence. Nina did not rush. She did not perform. She let the structure do the work. Then she addressed the access card issue directly. At the time, Ms. Vance believed someone had physically taken her card, Nina said. The audit shows something else. A duplicate RFID fob was created under Ms. Vance's employee ID from an administrator-level terminal. That duplicate fob is what opened the door at 9:22 p.m. Ms. Vance's actual card never left her jacket. Reed looked down. For months, that missing explanation had been used to make me sound paranoid. Now it sat on the table in plain language, stripped of fog. Vivian's attorney objected often. Helena Cross allowed some objections and denied others. That made it feel real. Messy, slow, human, not a movie. Then the students spoke. Riley barely looked up. Ms. Cole showed me my confidential notes and said the board could see them if I became difficult. Vivian whispered, "Riley!" Helena Cross cut in. "Ms. Cole, do not address the witness." Marcus Bell spoke next. Marcus was the basketball captain, a scholarship student with a polished smile and fear behind it. "She never said, 'I will take your scholarship,'" Marcus said. "She said students with conduct concerns sometimes lose community trust." Then she looked at my file. June, the student journalist, spoke last. "If you asked for proof," June said. Vivian called it harm. If you stayed quiet, her version became truth. Ethan spoke after the students. He looked at me once, then looked away. "Vivian asked me personal questions about Mara from the first week," he said. "Sleep, medication, nightmares, Atlas, our relationship. I thought she was trying to help." Nina asked, "Did you share private details?" Ethan swallowed. "Yes. I already knew this part. It still hurt," Nina said. "Which details?" Ethan's voice dropped. "I told Vivian Atlas sleeps by the bedroom door when Mara has bad nights." I looked at him then. He could barely meet my eyes. Nina asked, "Why?" "Because Vivian said she was trying to understand how to support Mara." "And did that detail appear later?" Ethan nodded. "In Vivian's complaint, she wrote that Mara was so dependent on the dog that he guarded her bedroom door like a weapon." The room went quiet. Ethan closed his eyes. "I repeated things I should not have repeated," he said. "She made concern feel responsible." Vivian looked at him, and for once there was no softness in her expression. "Ethan," she said, "you came to me because you were afraid of what you were seeing." He opened his eyes. "No," he said. "I came to you because I was afraid of conflict. You taught me to call that concern." The room went still. Nina then played my recording from the gala. Vivian's voice came through my phone speaker. "You should have resigned while people still felt sorry for you." No one moved. Vivian closed her eyes. Her attorney leaned toward her and whispered something. She whispered back too sharply. Atlas lifted his head. His ears moved forward. I looked down. He was not looking at Vivian's face. He was looking at her handbag, a cream leather bag placed beneath her chair. His nose worked once, then again. Old training came alive in him like a light switching on. He stood. I tightened the leash slightly. "Atlas," I whispered. "Easy." He took 2 slow steps and sat facing the bag. My chest tightened. That sit had a meaning. Indication. He had found a trained scent. Electronics, battery residue, something in the same family as Riley's prepaid phone, and the cracked phone case by the media building. But Atlas did not solve the case. He only pointed at the place where Vivian finally stopped controlling herself. Vivian saw him. Her face changed. Not much, but enough. Her attorney said, Please control the dog. He is controlled, I said. Helena Cross looked at me. Ms. Vance? He's indicating on a trained scent. Vivian gave a small, dry laugh. This is absurd. For 3 seconds, no one breathed. Vivian's hand tightened around the strap of her bag. Nina did not move toward her. She simply looked at Helena Cross and said, "For the record, we are not requesting a search of Miss Cole's bag without consent." Vivian grabbed the bag anyway and pulled it against her chest too fast. The zipper, already half open, caught on the chair leg. A black prepaid phone slid out and hit the carpet. No one touched it. No one had to. The room stared. Vivian said, "That's not mine." Her attorney closed his eyes. Eleanor Whitby, the donor whose money Vivian had been using as camouflage, said quietly, "It fell from your bag." Helena Cross raised one hand. "No one move." She instructed the school attorney to photograph the phone where it lay. Then she asked security to call local law enforcement to preserve potential evidence. The phone stayed on the floor until an officer arrived. No one opened it. No one played anything. No one made speeches over it. It was not proof yet. It was only enough to end the performance. Vivian had not collapsed in a grand confession. She was too careful for that. She unraveled in fragments. "That phone could belong to anyone," she said. Nina replied, "No one has claimed otherwise. It will be examined." Vivian looked at Reed. "Malcolm, you know how often students come to us after hours?" Reed's face went gray. Helena Cross said, "Ms. Cole, I recommend you stop speaking unless your attorney directs you." Vivian did not stop. "I never used anything for myself," she said. "Not like they're making it sound." Her attorney whispered, "Vivian, I moved support where it was needed." Vivian continued, voice rising but still trying to sound reasonable. "The board wanted clean numbers. Donors wanted grateful scholarship stories. Parents wanted no scandals. Students wanted miracles. I made things work inside a system that only pretended to care." Eleanor's face went pale with fury. Nina asked quietly, "When you say you moved support, are you referring to the funds routed through Bloom Path Wellness, Crescent Student Care, and Hale Consulting?" Vivian froze. That was the question she should have ignored. Instead, she said, "Those vendors provided support services." Nina looked down at her notes. "Services that 2 families say they never received?" Vivian's mouth tightened. Families don't always understand what support looks like. Riley's mother stood halfway from her chair. Helena Cross lifted one finger, and Riley's mother sat back down, shaking. Riley spoke, very softly. "You didn't help us stand. You kept us kneeling." Vivian turned toward her. "You have no idea what I protected you from." "I know exactly what you protected," Riley said. "Yourself." For the first time, Vivian had no answer ready. Helena Cross ended the meeting immediately. Law enforcement arrived 20 minutes later. The phone was secured. Statements were taken. The evidence packet was preserved. The board suspended Vivian indefinitely pending investigation. There was no dramatic arrest in front of students. No screaming hallway scene. No crowd chanting for justice. Just Vivian, sitting very still in a library chair, while the world she had built finally became paperwork. The investigation took months, but the pattern held. The prepaid phone linked back to Riley's messages. The duplicate RFE deed fob was found through the audit trail and matched the credential created under my employee ID. Vivian's aunt's lake house appeared on the vendor filings. The missing support funds were small, repeated diversions hidden behind compassionate language. Vivian lost her counseling license pending criminal proceedings and eventually accepted a plea deal for fraud, unlawful access to student records, and coercion. Reed resigned. Burke was removed. The students she had cornered were protected. Riley stayed. Marcus kept his scholarship. June published her article after the investigation became public record. Sloan transferred and sent me a handwritten apology. I did not forgive her immediately, but I kept the letter, and Ethan came to see me in December. Snow tapped gently against the windows of my apartment. Atlas slept near the heater, his paws twitching. Ethan stood in my kitchen holding a box of books I had left in his classroom. "I found these," he said. "Thanks." He set them on the table. For a while, neither of us spoke. "I was a coward," he said. "Yes." He nodded like he deserved that. I loved the version of peace where nobody was upset. That isn't peace. I know that now. I believed him. That hurt more than hating him would have. People can learn the truth and still arrive too late to be part of your future. I'm sorry I didn't stay, he said. I looked at Atlas. He did. Ethan's eyes filled. I know. He left the engagement ring on the table. I did not put it back on. By spring, Hawthorne Ridge offered me a permanent director position with a better salary, a renovated office, and a careful apology written by 3 lawyers. I accepted the apology and declined the office. At the end of the school year, Riley spoke at the scholarship ceremony. I sat in the back near the exit. Old habit, with Atlas lying beside my chair. Riley stepped up to the microphone. Her hands shook, but her voice held. There are people who help you stand, she said, and there are people who keep you kneeling so they can look tall. I learned the difference this year. The room stood for her. I did not cry. Almost. Atlas leaned his head against my knee. He always knew. After the ceremony, June found me in the hallway with her recorder. "One quote," she said. "No. For the record, no. For Atlas?" I looked down at him. He sneezed. "Traitor." June smiled. I thought about Vivian, about Ethan, about Reed, about every person who waited until proof was convenient before courage became possible. Then I said, "Loyalty isn't who stands beside you when the room applauds. It's who stays when the room turns away." June lowered the recorder. "That's annoyingly good." Atlas sneezed again, which from him meant he agreed. In the end, I did not beat Vivian by being louder. I beat her by outlasting the lie. And I survived because when everyone else stepped back, one old dog stayed.